The airport was bustling with activity as people hurried to their gates. It was another busy travel day with passengers moving swiftly through the terminals, trying to catch their flights on time. Among the crowd, a black man, dressed in a well-tailored suit, walked calmly toward the gate for his flight. His demeanor was professional, confident, and unbothered by the chaos around him. He glanced at his watch. He was right on schedule. His name was not one anyone would recognize immediately, but he carried himself with an aura of authority that didn't go unnoticed. As he approached the gate, a woman sitting in the first-class waiting area caught his eye. She was in her early 40s, sitting alone, clearly not interested in the noise around her. She had her headphones on but would occasionally glance up at the man as he walked by. There was something about him that caught her attention. She couldn't place it, but it made her uncomfortable. She watched as he walked past her, not a hint of hesitation in his steps. He reached the desk, showed his boarding pass, and was directed to his seat. Meanwhile, she continued to stare at him, her discomfort growing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. As he made his way onto the plane, the woman noticed he was seated in first class. For some reason, this seemed to upset her even more. It didn't sit right with her, especially because she felt she had the right to the best seat on the plane. Why should he be seated ahead of her, she thought. Her unease turned into something more, a sense of entitlement that was growing louder by the second. Once the man settled into his seat, the woman became fixated on him. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Maybe it was the color of his skin. Whatever the reason, she was having trouble focusing on anything else. She muttered under her breath, complaining quietly to the woman seated next to her. Her tone was filled with judgment and bitterness, though she tried to keep it discreet. As the plane continued to fill up, the woman's unease grew. She kept eyeing the man, and her irritation seemed to grow with each passing minute. She wanted to say something, to do something. She had no reason to be this upset, but she couldn't help herself. Eventually, she leaned forward in her seat, cleared her throat, and began to speak more openly. "Do you see that man?" She whispered to the flight attendant who had just passed her. "He's not supposed to be sitting here. He's not like the rest of us." The flight attendant, a young woman with a friendly smile, looked at her and tried to keep the situation under control. She nodded politely and continued with her duties, but the woman's comments didn't stop. She raised her voice slightly, making sure others around her could hear. "He's making me uncomfortable. He shouldn't be sitting in first class," she muttered, clearly trying to make her complaint heard. The flight attendant stopped for a moment, sensing that this wasn't just a passing comment but an issue that needed to be addressed. She glanced at the man who was seated quietly, reading through something on his tablet. There was no sign of any disturbance or issue with him. Still, she knew she had to listen to the customer. After all, no matter how unreasonable the complaint, she had to follow protocol. "I'll check on it," she said, trying to placate the woman. The woman smiled, convinced she was in the right. She leaned back in her seat, satisfied that her concerns were being taken seriously. But something inside her told her that this was just the beginning. The flight attendants continued with their work, but the woman couldn't help but keep an eye on the man. It wasn't just that he was in first class. There was something about him that made her angry, something she couldn't put into words. Maybe it was the way he walked, the way he looked so confident like he didn't belong. Maybe it was his smile. Maybe it was the fact that he seemed so calm in a space that made her feel entitled and privileged. Minutes passed, and the plane was finally ready for takeoff. The woman shifted in her seat, impatient, but the man beside her remained still, his focus unwavering. The flight attendant returned to the row, approaching the woman once again. "We'll be moving the man to another seat," she said calmly. The woman's eyes lit up. She felt victorious, like she had won. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. She was sure that her actions had been justified, that this was all part of maintaining order on the plane. She didn't know who the man was, but in her mind, he had no right to sit there. The flight attendant paused, still unsure about the entire situation, but she nodded, confirming that the complaint was being handled. Soon after, security personnel began walking down the aisle, their eyes scanning the cabin as they made their way toward the man. He looked up when he noticed the two men walking toward him. His calm expression didn't change as they stopped in front of him. The flight attendants stood nearby, watching, but the woman in her seat couldn't see what was happening, only catching glimpses of the scene from the corner of her eye. The conversation between the man and the security personnel was quiet, but it was clear that the situation was escalating. The man remained composed, offering no resistance as the officers asked him to stand. He stood up slowly, his face still neutral, and began gathering his things. The woman, sitting just a few rows behind, watched with an air of triumph, certain she had done the right thing. As the man walked past her to the front of the plane, she couldn't resist the urge to give him a glance. She looked up at him, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction, a confirmation that her actions were justified. But he too didn't react. He simply walked calmly past her, his expression unchanged. She watched him closely, still unable to fully comprehend the events that were unfolding. As he passed her seat, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of triumph and confusion. Why was he so calm? Why didn't he protest? Didn't he know that she had done the right thing? Unbeknownst to her, the man was much more than just a simple passenger. He was someone who held an important position, one that could change the course of the entire situation. But she wouldn't find that out just yet. For now, she was convinced that she had won. Little did she know, this would be the beginning of a much larger, more complex story that she couldn't have possibly imagined. As the plane took off, she leaned back in her seat, satisfied. What she didn't know was that the consequences of her actions were only just beginning to unfold. As the plane continued its ascent, the woman leaned back into her seat, feeling a sense of satisfaction wash over her. She was convinced that the right thing had been done. The man had been removed from the flight, and she was sure that it would be the end of the matter. She didn't realize the gravity of her actions or the person she had just had removed. To her, he was just another passenger, someone who didn't belong in the first-class section. But as the flight moved on, whispers began to spread through the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed the scene were exchanging looks, talking in low voices, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Some passengers were uneasy, unsure of what to make of the woman's complaint. Others were surprised at how easily the airline had taken her side. It didn't sit right with everyone, but no one was brave enough to speak out. After all, the flight was already in the air and things were not likely to change. Meanwhile, the man who had been removed from the flight didn't leave the airport immediately. He was escorted off the plane by security, his calm demeanor never wavering. Though he was being escorted from the plane, he didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, and didn't cause a scene. His behavior remained composed, but behind his cool exterior, there was something much deeper at play, something the woman and the other passengers had no idea about. The flight attendants, who had initially been called to resolve the issue, were left in an uncomfortable position. They had followed protocol, doing what they thought was right. But they too began to wonder if they had made the right decision. It wasn't their place to judge the validity of a passenger's complaint, but in this case things didn't feel right. They had acted on the woman's complaint without verifying the facts. Now they were left to deal with the consequences. Back at the gate, the woman remained in her seat, oblivious to the bigger picture. She was certain that she had done the right thing. But as the plane continued on its course, the realization of what had just transpired began to sink in. She had no idea that the man she had just had removed from the flight wasn't just any passenger. She had no idea that the man was a high-ranking official working for the Pentagon, with connections that could reach far beyond the airport or the plane. As the plane flew at cruising altitude, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. People who had overheard the woman's complaints started to exchange glances. Some began to wonder if the man had been wrongfully removed. Others felt uncomfortable with the idea that the woman had been so quick to make a judgment based on race. Still, most remained silent, not wanting to cause trouble. It was at that moment, in the quiet of the flight, that one passenger, a man seated a few rows behind the woman, leaned over and quietly asked his neighbor, "Did you see who they just kicked off the plane?" The neighbor, a woman with short blonde hair, turned to him with a puzzled look. "No, I didn't really catch it." "Why? Who was he?" The man who had been watching the whole situation unfold lowered his voice, his words carrying a sense of disbelief. "I think he works for the Pentagon. I've seen him at some high-level events. He's not just some random guy." The woman raised her eyebrows. "No way, are you serious?" "I'm telling you, that's not just some regular passenger. He's someone important. I can't believe they kicked him off the plane without even checking who he was. He's probably got some serious connections." The realization hit the woman like a ton of bricks. She turned pale as she began to understand the gravity of what had just happened. Her initial sense of triumph quickly turned into a cold sense of regret. What if the man really was someone important? What if her actions had just set off a chain of events that would end up causing her far more trouble than she could have ever imagined? Meanwhile, the man, still unaware of the developing conversations aboard the plane, was escorted to a private area in the airport. He had been calmly asked to step off the plane, and he had complied without any resistance. But this wasn't the first time he had encountered discrimination, and he knew how to handle such situations with dignity. As the minutes passed, a flight supervisor approached him. She introduced herself and began apologizing for the incident. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," she said, her voice sincere. "We had no idea who you were, and we sincerely regret this situation. I hope you understand that the decision to remove you wasn't personal." The man nodded slowly, maintaining his composed demeanor. "I understand," he replied, his voice calm. "But this should never have happened." The supervisor, visibly nervous, continued. "Please accept our deepest apologies. We'll take care of the situation. We will make sure this doesn't happen again." The man didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, letting the weight of the situation settle in. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. He had been through enough in his life to know that there would always be people who would judge him based on his appearance, his background, or his race. But it was moments like this that reminded him of how deep those prejudices ran, and how far some people would go to act on them. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the woman was still wrestling with the unfolding events. The realization of her mistake was beginning to take hold of her, but it was too late to reverse what had already been done. She had no idea that this would become a headline story. She had no idea that she had just made a decision that would end up changing her life forever. As the plane flew toward its destination, the flight attendants continued their duties, trying to put the incident behind them. But the conversation among passengers had shifted. What had started as an uneasy whisper of, "Who was that man?" was now growing louder. People were beginning to piece together the truth, and they weren't happy about it. What the woman had done was seen by some as an act of racism, an unjustified move to remove a person based solely on their appearance. The tension in the cabin was palpable. No one wanted to be the one to confront the woman, but the judgment in their eyes was enough to make her shift uncomfortably in her seat. It wasn't long before the truth started to spread. Slowly but surely. The man she had so easily dismissed wasn't just anyone. He was someone with power, someone who could make things happen, and soon the world would know what had happened to him. As the flight continued its course, the woman sat in her seat, trying to convince herself that she had done nothing wrong. The discomfort in her stomach grew, but she tried to push it away, telling herself that the man was a troublemaker, that she had simply done what was necessary. After all, he had been removed from the plane without incident, and the flight was proceeding as planned. In her mind, the issue was settled. But deep down, a quiet voice told her that something didn't feel right. Meanwhile, in the airport terminal, the man who had been removed from the flight sat calmly in a private lounge. He wasn't panicked or upset, but his mind was already working. The calmness with which he had handled the situation wasn't just for show. It was the result of years of training, experience in dealing with difficult circumstances. He had faced many challenges in his life, but none quite like this. He knew that the woman's actions weren't just about him. They were about something much larger. They were about the pervasive prejudice that still existed in the world, something that people like her didn't always understand or even recognize. It was clear to him that her complaint wasn't based on any actual issue. She hadn't felt threatened. She hadn't been in danger. She had simply made an assumption based on his appearance, based on a stereotype. But the man wasn't just any ordinary passenger. He worked for the Pentagon, a job that involved matters of national security and intelligence. His position gave him access to information that most people would never even hear about. It also meant that the consequences of the woman's actions would be far-reaching. This wasn't a situation that could be brushed off. It would be addressed and it would be handled at the highest levels. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. On the other end of the line, a voice answered. "Sir, how can I assist you?" He took a deep breath. "I've been removed from a flight based on a false complaint. The situation was handled poorly and I need you to look into it immediately." The voice on the other end responded with urgency. "Understood, sir. We'll start an investigation right away. Stay where you are. We'll have someone contact you shortly." As he ended the call, he leaned back in the chair, his expression neutral. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He knew this was just another day, another instance where he would need to step in and correct something that had gone wrong. But this time, there was more at stake. The woman's actions had consequences beyond the immediate embarrassment she was about to face. They were about to send ripples through the system, and he wasn't sure how much damage those ripples would cause. Back on the plane, passengers had started to whisper more openly about what had happened. The quiet murmurs were now full-blown conversations. "Did you hear?" One woman said to her neighbor. That guy was someone important. He wasn't just a regular passenger. Another passenger nodded. "Yeah, I overheard some of the flight attendants talking. They said he worked for the Pentagon." The woman who had made the complaint sat in silence, her mind racing. The realization had just hit her. The man she had so casually accused of being a threat wasn't just any person. He was someone who had a significant role in the government, someone who had influence, who could make things happen. As the whispers grew louder, the woman's confidence began to falter. What had she done? Her initial satisfaction at having gotten rid of the man was now replaced with fear. She didn't know who he was when she first saw him, and she hadn't cared. But now the truth was coming out, and she could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, the judgment in their gaze. The flight attendants, meanwhile, were dealing with their own discomfort. They had followed the woman's complaint without question, but now they were starting to feel uneasy about how things had been handled. They had no way of knowing the man's true identity, and yet they had acted as though he didn't belong. They had allowed the situation to escalate without properly assessing the facts. As professionals, they were supposed to serve everyone equally, regardless of their appearance or background. But in this case, they had failed. One of the flight attendants, a young woman named Claire, had been particularly affected by what had transpired. She had been the one to initially speak with the woman, trying to diffuse the situation. But now, as the truth about the man's identity became clear, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. She had been too quick to act on the woman's complaint, too eager to please. In hindsight, she realized that she should have questioned the situation more carefully. The man hadn't caused any disturbance. He hadn't done anything to warrant being removed. And yet she had stood by as the situation unfolded, doing nothing to prevent it. She walked over to her colleague, a man named Ryan, who had also been involved in the incident. "Do you think we made the right call?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with doubt. Ryan shook his head, his expression grim. "I'm not sure. I just did what I was told. But now that we know who he is..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "We messed up," Claire said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane. "We didn't even think to check who he was. We just took her word for it. What if she's wrong?" Ryan sighed. "We can't undo it now. We'll have to wait and see what happens next." As the flight continued, Claire's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a serious mistake. She knew that the woman's complaint had been based on nothing more than prejudice, and she couldn't help but wonder if there was something they could have done differently. The truth was, they were all complicit in what had happened. They had allowed racism to dictate the course of the flight, and now they were paying the price. As the plane neared its destination, the woman sat frozen in her seat, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She was no longer the confident, self-assured passenger who had made the complaint. She was now the person who had been responsible for getting an innocent man kicked off the plane, someone who had allowed her own biases to cloud her judgment. She had no idea how much trouble she was in, but deep down she knew it was just the beginning. As the plane touched down at its destination, the woman remained seated, her thoughts in turmoil. The once quiet confidence she had felt earlier was now replaced with a deep sense of anxiety. She had always prided herself on being someone who spoke her mind, someone who could handle difficult situations with ease. But now, with the truth beginning to unfold around her, she realized just how wrong she had been. The man she had gotten removed from the plane was not just another passenger. He was someone who had the power to influence things far beyond her understanding. The plane came to a halt at the gate, and the passengers began to disembark. But for the woman, the usual rush of people moving quickly through the terminal felt distant, almost as if she were floating outside of her own body. She slowly gathered her things, moving with a sense of reluctance, knowing that the consequences of her actions were only just beginning to take shape. She tried to avoid eye contact with the other passengers as she made her way through the terminal, but she could feel their eyes on her. Some of them had already pieced together what had happened. She had no idea how much of the truth was out there, but she could sense that she was being judged. The whispers she had heard earlier on the plane had grown louder, and the uncertainty in her mind had turned into an undeniable reality. She had made a serious mistake. As she exited the terminal, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her manager, asking her to check in as soon as possible. Her heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced, trying to think of any reason why her manager might be reaching out. The tone of the message didn't seem like a simple check-in. It felt urgent. She opened the message and read it quickly. The words were clear and direct. "There's a situation. We've been made aware of a complaint. Please contact me immediately." A chill ran down her spine. The woman's mind raced even faster now. Was this about the man on the plane? Had he already reported the incident? She couldn't be sure, but she knew that whatever was coming next, she wasn't ready for it. As she made her way to her car, she tried to steady her nerves. She told herself that it would all blow over. People overreacted sometimes, right? The man would probably forget about it, and she would never hear from him again. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Something told her that this wasn't just going to fade away. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. This time, it was a news notification. She clicked on the headline, her heart racing as the words appeared on her screen. "Flight incident involving Pentagon official sparks outrage." She froze. The article went on to explain that a black man, a high-ranking Pentagon official, had been removed from a flight due to a complaint from a passenger. The report was careful not to name anyone directly, but the details were clear enough. It was unmistakably the incident she had caused. As she read through the article, her stomach turned. There were no direct quotes from her, but the story painted a picture of a wrongful accusation, a situation fueled by racial prejudice. The article described how the flight attendants had been quick to act on the woman's complaint, and how passengers had reacted in disbelief once the truth came out. The final line of the article struck her the hardest. The incident is now under investigation by both the airline and federal authorities, as concerns of racial profiling have been raised. She had hoped this would blow over, but now it was clear. The situation had become much bigger than she could have imagined. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from her manager. She knew she had no choice but to answer. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Where are you?" her manager asked, his tone serious. "I'm on my way home," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk." "I've just seen the news," he said. "This situation has escalated quickly. It's already being discussed by the company's legal team. You need to be prepared. This could get ugly." The woman felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean?" "It's just a misunderstanding." Her manager sighed, clearly frustrated. "You really don't get it, do you? This is bigger than just a misunderstanding. This could have serious consequences." "Do you know who that man was?" "He wasn't just a random passenger. He works for the Pentagon. This incident is now being treated as a case of racial discrimination, and people are talking about it all over the country. We need to figure out how we're going to handle this." Her mind was spinning. The weight of the situation was sinking in with each passing moment. She hadn't realized who the man was when she complained. She hadn't understood the ramifications of her actions. She had simply acted on her biases, assuming that her complaints would be heard without question. Now everything had changed. Her life was about to be turned upside down. "We need to get you in touch with legal," her manager continued. "They'll help you figure out what to do next. But I need you to stay calm. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about the company, and we need to manage the fallout." The woman hung up the phone, her mind reeling. She had never expected something like this to happen. She had no idea that a simple complaint would spiral into something so catastrophic. She was being accused of something far worse than she had imagined. She wasn't just being called out for her racism. She was now part of a story that was being discussed on national news. As the woman sat in her car, staring at the screen of her phone, she realized that she couldn't escape what she had done. The consequences were already set in motion, and no amount of denial or avoidance would change that. She had made a choice, and now she would have to live with it. Meanwhile, back at the airport, the man who had been wrongfully removed from the plane was dealing with the fallout from his end. He had already made contact with his superiors, and they had assured him that everything would be handled. But he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about sending a message that racism and discrimination would not be tolerated, no matter who you were or where you came from. He wasn't interested in revenge, but he was determined to ensure that the woman's actions had consequences. He knew that this wasn't the kind of situation that could simply be swept under the rug. He was someone who worked with sensitive information, someone who understood the power of accountability, and he was prepared to make sure the right steps were taken.